Hello everyone. This is the fourth and final video on the informal fallacies. In this video, we will look at three common informal fallacies: the ad hominem and genetic fallacy, which will be treated together, the appeal to ignorance, and the appeal to the good or bad consequences of holding a belief. Let's start with the ad hominem and genetic fallacy. An ad hominem is an attack on the person giving an argument rather than the argument itself. It's more commonly known as a personal attack. It is always negative. By that I mean it's used to oppose a viewpoint, not to support one. The genetic fallacy is usually negative, but sometimes positive. Typically, it involves rejecting a viewpoint solely or primarily based on where or who it came from, rather than an even-handed assessment of the viewpoint's merits. What ties the ad hominem and genetic fallacy together is that both fail to assess the evidence for or against a viewpoint, and focus instead on the source. Let's look at some examples. Richard Dawkins says that belief in God is delusional, but he's the delusional one. It is true that Dawkins makes this claim about belief in God. It's also true that that claim is very offensive. But the idea that Dawkins' position can be dismissed simply by calling him delusional is an example of an ad hominem attack. To say of someone that they're delusional is to say, of course, that they have some kind of psychiatric symptoms, and that's a personal attack. By the way, it doesn't make the attack any better if you think that Richard Dawkins himself is committing an ad hominem attack. Here's a second example. Jane's idea about how to expand our sales shouldn't be taken seriously. After all, Jane's a woman, and women aren't well suited to make business decisions. This is an obviously fallacious argument, and it is right on the razor-thin edge between an ad hominem attack, because Jane is being singled out, and a genetic fallacy, which can be much more general than a single person. The entire class of women are being called into question here. What hasn't happened in this example is a careful assessment or examination of what exactly Jane's idea was and whether it was a good idea or a bad idea based on a fair assessment of the evidence for and against it. Here's a third and final example. The modern environmentalist movement has its roots in nature writing from the 18th and 19th century. Many of these writers believed in the superiority of whites over other races. So protecting the environment from industrialization is deeply problematic. This one is a much more clear-cut example of the genetic fallacy. No single individual is being personally attacked in this critique. But the origin of the environmentalist movement is being attacked. And once again, the specific practical policy ideas of the modern environmental movement are not being evaluated as good or bad based on the evidence. Instead, they're being dismissed as guilty by association because the roots of that movement go back 200 years to when many of the writers advocating this kind of environmental protection happened also to be racists. Let's turn our attention to the appeal to ignorance. In the appeal to ignorance, the word ignorance is referring to the absence of evidence. In an appeal to ignorance, the fact that there is no evidence against a claim is taken as evidence for it. Alternatively, the fact that there is no evidence for a claim is taken as evidence against it. But this is very important. The absence of evidence is just that. It does not count as supporting or undermining evidence. If you're portioning your beliefs to the evidence, then when there is an absence of evidence, the appropriate attitude to take is to withhold judgment. Let's look at some examples of the appeal to ignorance. For some theists, the following argument is convincing. You cannot prove that there isn't a God, so there is one. At the same time, some atheists find the following reasoning just as convincing. You cannot prove that there is a God, so there isn't one. Not all theists think this way, and not all atheists think this way. But there is a group, agnostics, who hold a very interesting position here in the middle. Agnostics would agree that God's existence cannot be disproved, and they agree that God's existence cannot be proved. The agnostic attitude is that in that kind of a situation, the rational thing to do is to withhold judgment either way and to suspend belief. Here's a final example. Science hasn't shown that the anti-malarial drug chloroquine phosphate doesn't cure COVID-19, so it probably works. Again, the fact that science hasn't shown that the cure doesn't work is not evidence that it does work. Now let's turn to the last fallacy, the appeal to the good or bad consequences of holding a belief. An appeal to the good or bad consequences of holding a belief focus on the psychosocial benefits or harms associated with the belief state, that's a mental state, instead of the evidence for or against what is believed, in this case, the proposition or the assertion. Holding a belief may have benefits for you, but the fact that it has those benefits does not count as evidence in favor of it. Many positive illusions are like this. Positive illusions are claims that are false or unfounded, but which nevertheless are beneficial. So many people tend to overestimate their level of control over a situation. And that may have many positive benefits, but it doesn't make the belief true. Likewise, many people have the tendency to believe that they're more attractive than the wider public actually regards them. And that may have many positive benefits, but the benefits don't count as evidence supporting the belief. Similarly, holding a belief may have some psychological downsides. For example, it could be depressing or counterproductive. But the fact that it has bad consequences does not count as evidence against it. So the flip side of the example of positive illusions might be depressive realism. People with severe depression tend to have much more realistic assessments of their level of control over things. Obviously, those realistic assessments don't have positive outcomes or benefits for those individuals. But the fact that those beliefs are not associated with positive outcomes does not count as evidence against them. Let's look at some other examples. The character Neo in the movie The Matrix is asked why he doesn't believe in fate. And he responds, "I don't like the thought that I'm not in control." Now, if he was asked what evidence he has for not believing in fate, his answer simply misses the mark. The fact that he finds the thought unpleasant is not evidence against it. So fatalism is the view that the future course of your life is already in time's womb and there's nothing you can do to change it. Think of the character Oedipus from classical antiquity. He was fated to kill his father and marry his mother. When he learned of his fate and when his parents learned of his fate, they went to great pains to avoid it. However, guess what happened? Spoiler alert, he killed his father and married his mother. So the fact that Neo doesn't like the thought that he's not in control is not evidence against the thesis of fatalism. Fatalism may be true and unpleasant to believe. Here's a second example. You should believe in life after death because it will give you hope in the face of despair. It may be true that it's a good idea to believe in life after death because it will give you hope in the face of despair. However, the fact that the thought that there's life after death gives you hope in the face of despair does not count as evidence that there is life after death. The belief in life after death may have these very positive outcomes or consequences for you, but still not be true. Finally, children who are taught evolution today will become mass shooters tomorrow. I wish I were making that argument up. Once again, even if it were true, and I doubt that it is, even if it were true that children who are taught evolution today will become mass shooters tomorrow, it doesn't count as evidence against the theory of evolution. Evidence for or against evolution is going to be found in the empirical study of the natural world. So I think one should certainly question whether belief in evolutionary theory has these bad outcomes. Almost since the publication of Darwin's On the Origin of Species, people have been warning about the dire consequences for society if people believe in it. But again, those consequences are not evidence for or against the empirical adequacy of the theory of evolution. In this video, we looked at 3 common informal fallacies: ad hominem and the genetic fallacy, which were treated together, appeal to ignorance, and the appeal to the good or bad consequences of holding a belief. This concludes our 4-part series on the informal fallacies.